Welcome to episode 6 of C is for Columbia, our internet podcast where we talk about life, politics, and what's going on in the world. We hope you had a very happy holidays. It is closing up on the year of 2022 right now. So we are going to go ahead and get started. Sam, what do you got for us?
Awesome. And by the way, happy holidays to everyone. We're shooting this on the 26th, so a day after Christmas. I actually spent Christmas in Cottonwood, Arizona. Cooked my family a goose. It was about 11 pounds. It was delicious. Really recommend trying goose if you haven't had that before.
I hear it's greasy.
It's greasy. DM me if you want the recipe because it was a lot of fun to make, but also very expensive. We had goose and champagne for Christmas, so kind of a high-class Christmas. So I had fun.
Nice.
I'm back in Phoenix now, banker's holiday, But anyway, kind of getting into the show. So I had a few things I wanted to talk about. So we've been hearing a lot about ever since Roe versus Wade got repealed, what could follow up with that in terms of taking away potentially women's rights with reproductive rights specifically. So Donald Trump appointed judge from 2017 actually recently approved an anti-contraception lawsuit. The defendant, Alexandra, argues that, Title X violates his rights as a parent. He states that he wants to raise his children in a traditional Christian manner and that Title X is actually unconstitutional. He states that while his children are not actually attempting to obtain birth control from Title X, this hypothetical scenario still prevents him and other parents from raising their children to practice abstinence. So this kind of ties into, because obviously it wasn't that long ago when Roe versus Wade got repealed, which is one issue, but now we're kind of seeing a fallout in terms of reproductive rights. Following that, Donald Trump, while he wasn't a very effective president, had the ability to appoint a lot of judges that aren't going away anytime too soon. And, we are kind of starting to see this in terms of not just abortion, but, birth control and other things of that nature, how those are going to kind of come under attack now. And, the courts are very conservative. The Supreme Court, if this was something that would go to the Supreme Court, is obviously very conservative and, on the Republican side on these type of issues. So, I do wonder, kind of expanding off of that, what this is going to mean in terms of reproductive rights. In the future, could we potentially see limits on things like birth control, which is something that had been taken for granted? You have birth control pills, you have Plan B, you have all of these other, mechanisms. So as a result of abortion rights, diminishing, you're now going to sort of see what I sort of predicted was this fallout of, grander, reproductive rights, so to speak, start to come under attack. And, there's a few ways you could go with this. I mean, on one hand, yes, conservatives do have the advantage now with the courts and being able to pass these kind of laws or, challenge these rights. But, you also have to wonder, a lot of people do say that abortion hurt the Republicans in the midterms. So if they were going to go ahead and go further with that and go after, such things such as birth control, if this would even lower their popularity even more. Obviously, the 2024 election is a while away, and I have no interest in making any prediction for that election. I'm sure whatever prediction I'll make will probably be wrong, as they're usually wrong. But, I do see, there's kind of a, bigger picture here. We could see diminishing reproductive rights going away. We could see how that could affect, the following elections coming up in a few years. So, I thought that was pretty interesting. What's kind of amusing to me about this article is the person who challenged this issue said that their children are apparently not interested in birth control, but he wants to limit access to birth control anyway because in his mind, this impedes on his right as a parent to tell his kids that they're not allowed to have birth control, I guess is his argument. I don't want to be too partisan, but that's kind of silly to me, I think, from a political standpoint. Is it really about his kids or is it just more of an ideological issue and he's kind of taking advantage of, the parental right aspect
Yeah, it
of it, I
certainly
guess?
sounds like that would be a challenge that was made in order to get an ideological point through. And is that's being appealed up to the Supreme Court, or is that going through an appeals process?
I mean, it very well could soon. I think at this point it's still at the lower levels, but that's kind of my point. It's going in the bigger picture. I mean, this could go to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is very pro-life as of right now. Donald Trump, of course, was able to appoint three, Supreme Court judges, so they'd have the advantage there. I guess my point is if we were to take this to the logical conclusion, what would that mean electorally, though? I mean, would that hurt the Republicans,
Oh,
going forward? Because
and that's hard to say.
it is, because abortion is already a little bit more in favor for liberals when it comes to just like public opinion. But I think, reproductive rights like birth control, there's plenty of people who are pro life that still want, birth control to be available as long as you pay for it. And I don't know how, I can't imagine that would be very popular with.
Yeah, it would not be very popular to then execute a ban on birth control. What could be popular amongst a certain, if they're trying to get a particular base fired up about it, is to use that as a rhetorical point, which I see that happen sometimes. A lot of the times, especially when Roe v. Wade was in practice, was all that would be used rhetorically with no intention to make any actions on it a lot of the time. In order to garner support behind, and that was only for when elections were going on as well, in order to garner support, the pro-life support. So they rhetorically claim these rather extreme positions in order to garner support with no intention necessarily of executing on those rather extreme positions. The other thing I would say regarding this is the case hinging on the 14th Amendment, the privacy aspect.
Yeah.
It's going to be hinging on that privacy aspect. Okay. So in that case, because it's hinging on a similar point that Roe v. Wade was hinging on, yes, there's probably some intention to use that same logic in order to get even more court leniency on that particular issue, the issue of birth control, the issue of parents having a right to instruct or teach particular values to their kids, whatever that might be. Also, well, we're talking about the court's role in all of this, right? I mean, that's essentially what we're talking about. How does the court play a role, the Supreme Court of the federal government, play a role in deciding things like birth control? And I had conceptualized this even prior to when Roe v. Wade was overturned, when it was being talked about being overturned, when the court had become rather conservative. The conservative majority in the court had formed. That I'm not sure that the court's moving towards a conservative view of abortion or birth control or any of these right to life or right to choice issues will necessarily push states into an area where states become banning birth control or states start strongly removing Plan B or things like that. Or if they do try those things, they will likely be quite unpopular in practice. And that unpopularity will actually potentially liberalize issues like birth control and abortion. It may actually play to the other side of the issue, meaning that they'll actually be able to move on banning birth control and doing all these things that they always talk about. However, when those things are actually done, they may have to backpedal them because they will be quite unpopular in practice. they will not be as popular as they were rhetorically, if that makes sense. Does that kind of make sense what I'm saying?
No, and that's kind of the point I was trying to make. Is it's like from a legal standpoint, they could overturn these things and ban things like birth control. But I mean, how popular is that going to make the Republican Party going forward? I mean, I tell you
Right,
what, like
right.
independent voters don't want birth control to be banned. I mean, they don't.
Some might, some might, rhetorically speaking. Again, I mean, it's hard to say what people in their heads would want versus when it's on the books. Like, do you want this or do you not want this? You know, once it's in practice, do you
Right.
actually want it? People might answer that they want it. I don't know. And there might be some contingent that answer, yes, I want this. But once it's actually on the books, is it that popular? Do we really want that? Yeah, that's kind of the point I'm getting at. And that's the nice thing about, at least I think it's the nice thing about how our Supreme Court works, is that it doesn't make decisions at a state by state level. It makes those broad sweeping decisions at a federal level. States can then try, okay, we'll ban Plan B. And then if it sucks, then other states aren't going to go forward with it. Or if they do, they're kind of sticking their foot in their mouth, so to speak. And slowly, I actually think that might liberalize the issue. Because for the longest time, abortion was one of those, it bifurcated people. If you wanted to really screw up a conversation, you would start talking about abortion. You'd get all sorts of anger going. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
And if you want to kind of liberalize that, I think there may be some reason to allow for states to start doing these things that a lot of these redder states would always talk about doing. Let them try it and see how popular it actually is and see how functional it actually is. And if it isn't, then I think you'll start seeing a pullback from all that extreme rhetoric. That's at least my hope. That would be my hope on that particular issue.
Well, I guess we'll have to see what happens. At this point, it's still in the lower courts. But, could be something to revisit in a few months. So, we've kind of talked about this in the past in terms of how Biden made the attempt to forgive student loans, or at least partially forgive student loans. So there's this organization called the Missouri Higher Education Loan Authority that's trying to stop Biden from forgiving student loans at any cost. They're currently also filing a lawsuit that's actually set to go to the Supreme Court next year, so 2023, which will directly challenge, arguably, the biggest domestic policy issue of Biden's presidency. This organization argues that if Biden forgives the student debt, that this organization will lose money because they'll have less accounts to manage. So I brought this up specifically because this is set to go to the Supreme Court in 2023. So this may be a big issue a few months from now. So yeah, I mean, in terms of forgiving student loans, I have a lot of student loans. I wouldn't mind having some of those forgiven personally with my master's degree on a personal level. But, in terms of like Biden's ability to do this, I remember, earlier in Biden's presidency, Nancy Pelosi was saying, the president can't just forgive student debt. And I think some people took that as, Pelosi is corporate and she just doesn't want this to happen because money or whatever. But I think what she was trying to say, though, was that, like, the president literally can't do this.
Right.
And if he tries
Interests.
to do this, it's going to be challenged and it's not going to go very far. And in hindsight, she may have been right, even if what she was saying was unpopular, especially with younger people. So going into that, I mean, I think it's very likely that, and maybe I'm pointing out the obvious at this point, but I think it's very likely that Biden's plan to relieve some of student debt is not going to go forward. This is going to get challenged. It's already being challenged by the courts, and it's probably going to get overturned by the Supreme Court, especially with this case that I brought up previously. A couple of questions I would ask. One, did Biden actually think he would be able to do this? Was this something he was maybe doing because he was looking unpopular in the midterms and he thought this would give him some momentum? Um,
Sure.
he wasn't trying to completely forgive all of it. I think it was roughly 10 to 20,000, depending on what kind of loans you took out, basically. I think, yeah, so it's still just partial forgiveness, but obviously ever since, 2015, 2016, this has been a big issue, especially with young progressive voters. Bernie Sanders kind of championed this on his first presidential campaign. It was part of why he became so
Right.
popular, in my
Right.
opinion. And I always said, like, if Bernie Sanders had gotten elected, he probably wouldn't. He would have tried to give him credit, but I don't think he would have been able to make this happen either. But I mean, yeah, from a legal standpoint, it doesn't seem like this is going to happen, which is, pretty disheartening for progressives. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like they said, like, there's a lot of money involved in this. There's a lot of these organizations that manage these accounts, and
Yeah.
obviously these organizations would lose money, so it's going to be very difficult to push back on that, from a
Sure.
political standpoint. Um,
Sure.
I would have liked to see some. Here's what I think. Like, just going into student loans, the cost of education has gone up tremendously. And I think what we could go ahead and do that might be more realistic, a lot of states are actually, on a local level, making community college free. It's free in Tennessee, it's free in Oregon, it's free in a lot of other states. I don't think you would want to nationalize that. I think you might want to leave that at a state level and just kind of have that go state by state personally. I just think it would be a lot simpler. But, we may have to kind of move past, I think a lot of us growing up, we kind of had that mindset, and our parents instilled this on us, and our teachers instilled that at us, that when you're 18, you go to a 4-year college, you have
Of
this
course.
typical experience, and they're like, these 4 amazing years where you go to college and, you stay in a dorm freshman year and you do all these things. We may have to move past that mindset now because there's not a lot we're going to be able to do to lower the cost of education, and it may just be unrealistic to have that traditional 4-year experience where you go right out of high school. We may need to kind of look, on a personal level of, cheaper choices like potentially free community college, get an associate's degree, and then only have to pay for 2 years of college potentially. We may need to look at other forms of education too, because, one thing I would always say is I think they did push, though, a lot of people to go to college that maybe didn't necessarily need to be in college, and you don't necessarily need a college degree to be
Right.
successful. So I think, like, just expanding beyond kind of like the political aspect of this in terms of, Biden trying to forgive student loans, the cost of education, we may need to kind of evolve a little bit as a society and rethink the stereotypical 4 years of college, especially when a lot of these students don't end up completing their degrees, or they get degrees but they don't end up in a sector of work that matches what they actually majored in.
Yeah, it's very
Um,
common. Right.
it is very common. And, I mean, I majored in political science. I do work in politics. It's not my full time job. I am currently doing a paid internship for a political organization, but it's a side hustle for me. I don't work in politics full time, and I never really have. So even from my perspective, like, I didn't necessarily need a political science degree to work for the company I'm working for right now. I just think we may need to kind of rethink this mindset that was kind of forced on millennials, that if you go to college, you'll be very rich. You've got to have this 4-year experience, and you've got to do it, and you've got to do it when you're 18. I mean, we're having like 18-year-old kids with like no financial literacy going out of state to some college, taking like tens of thousands of dollars at a time out on loans. They end up majoring in something they can't get a job in. And, then you factor in the high cost of living. It's just a mess. We may need to kind of rethink the educational journey for young people, in my opinion.
No, I absolutely agree. And I've thought that for a little while now. I think it's funny that in the 2000s you had this issue with credit card companies on college campuses giving out what was essentially bad credit to 18 to 22-year-olds, giving them credit cards. And that was eventually banned. because of all the bad debt that was accumulating in that. Sign up for this credit card and you can pay off whatever you want on it, and it wasn't really a checked market. And eventually that practice was banned. I think in a similar way, you are having a lot of debt being pushed onto people that are early in their career and don't really think of it. They almost think of it as just normal. That'll just be the debt that I'll have for a while, but it won't affect me that much. And in many instances, it won't affect them that much, as long as they, like you said, follow the cookie cutter example of go to the college and then get almost like the game of life style. You've played the game of life, right? You can choose to go. Yeah. You go to college and you get the higher paying job. Well, in the game of life, that works. In life as we know it right now, I know personally tons of people who have gone to 4-year colleges, getting degrees in things they wanted to study and having a great time doing it. And then they get out and they can find jobs. It's usually not that they can't find any job. And sometimes it's related to their field, but it certainly is not enough to justify the debt that they've accumulated through doing that. And like you said, a lot of the millennial generation. So I think that rethinking that has been on the books for quite a while now. And I don't think it's a sustainable model to do these 4-year colleges, liberal arts schools, whatever. I think that there's tons of other opportunities, though. Trade schools, community colleges, like you said, 2-year community colleges, apprenticeships, all those things that do very much exist, but maybe not be as attractive to an 18-year-old who's just getting out of high school. If they're looking at their future and they see, well, I'm going to go to the apprenticeship and this is going to be my job. And if that's how they see life at that point in their life, that the choice that I'm making here is going to set me up, it's not going to be as attractive necessarily to say, I'll go join a apprenticeship for becoming an electrician. And that might not meet up with those goals that they want to achieve, even though you might be very happy as an electrician, make a good living, and are able to still, outside of their career, outside of their jobs, do tons of stuff that they enjoy doing, giving them a sense of fulfillment. So I guess that's my 2 cents on that. Regarding Biden's forgiveness program, I think that kind of moves back to, he did make this commitment, and I think he made the commitment in part because of the Bernie faction within the Democratic Party, the progressive faction, that there would be some form of debt forgiveness. It had to be some form, not sure what form. And I think during his administration, they kind of concocted a particular how that forgiveness would look and how they might pull that off. I think that $10,000 and $20,000 number, not to say those were picked out of thin air, but I don't think that number was as significant as just having some number, if that makes sense. They picked the $10,000 and the $20,000 in order to say that's the amount that we're going for. Be happy with it or not. Many people were very happy with it. Many people felt this doesn't do much at all to really forgive debt because you haven't changed anything about the accumulation of the debt in the future. Yeah. You're doing a one-time forgiveness and not changing anything about the accumulation of debt. You're basically taking a little scoop out of the boat that's leaking and dumping it over the side while the boat continues to take on water.
Yeah.
However, I do think that was then used in an expectation almost that it would be challenged. I think there was an expectation that it would be challenged in the courts. Because then what he can say, and what he did say, after it is challenged and held up in the courts is, well, my debt forgiveness hasn't gotten through. So what I'm going to do is continue kicking the can down the road with the debt repayment interest deferral program that's been going on since COVID, where a lot of that debt that is federally held does not accumulate any interest. Now, what that does is actually does plug some of the holes in the boat. Because if you're on a sinking ship, assuming that the student debt boat is going to sink, assuming that it's going to collapse in a similar way to the '08 housing market was, collapsed if nothing is done. What you have to do is slow the leaking. And actually, probably more will be done to slow the leaking if you stop the interest on a lot of the debt that does exist versus just a one-time forgiveness. So in that way, I think perhaps the debt forgiveness is working out in Biden's favor, even if it's being challenged, and even if that $10,000, $20,000 isn't ever allowed. And yeah, that'll make people upset because they didn't get their $10,000 or $20,000 forgiveness settled. But whatever, that's not the point. The point is stopping a sinking ship. And if you can stop interest accumulating on this debt and people are still paying off the principal with no extra accumulated interest, you actually might have saved the ship. So, but in order to do that, he has to keep kicking the can down the road. So, and he kicked the can a lot with that student interest deferral, if you remember, because he said in September that he was going to prolong it again until December 31st, and that was going to be the end of it. Do you remember this?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And he said that was going to be the end of it. And then when the courts are starting to bind up his $10,000, $20,000 forgiveness, he said again, well, then we're going to kick the can even further. We're going to defer that due date, deadline, even further down the road. And perhaps that was already planned. Perhaps it wasn't. I don't know. But for better or worse, I think that actually plays better in his favor. Now, that doesn't stop the interest accumulating on privately held debt. It doesn't stop all the interest accumulating on debt, but it does at least slow the leak in my boat example.
Yeah, and I agree. And like, this is kind of the issue I had with Biden's plan. It's like, in a literal sense, as somebody who has a master's degree, like 10, 20,000 would have made some impact on me. But it's kind of like you said, you're just on a sinking ship and you scoop like a cup of water out, but the boat's still sinking and this bubble is going to burst.
Right, exactly.
Eventually. So I actually personally, just where I'm at, I would care more about maybe removing the interest on the debt almost a little bit more than simply forgiving it, because to me the interest is a bigger factor in terms of me being able. Now obviously everybody's in a different place. This is just kind of my situation and what I think would kind of work best for me. These are all unique situations and we're all kind of in a different place. Some people might have less debt than me, and like 10,000 or 20,000 would be enough to just pay it all off. So it just depends. And, that's kind of why I like opened with that point earlier about how we need to like change how we look at education. Because like, to give like an extreme example, so when I was a freshman at the Evergreen State College where I got my bachelor's degree, I knew people who only attended for orientation week. Like, they were there for orientation week, partied like crazy, and then dropped out like 1 or 2 weeks into the semester.
Oh, wow.
And you have to think about that, because that's like probably in the ballpark, depending if you're in state or out of state, of like $20,000, $30,000 a year or a semester. And here's what I would kind of say to that. Like, I get it. These parents sent their kids to college because they wanted them to have the experience. Like, here's the thing. If you're going to like throw away $20,000, just give your kid $20,000 and send them to like Europe for.
Yeah, they'll throw it away for you.
Yeah, just send them to like France or Italy or Belgium or something for a year and let them travel or whatever. I mean, that would be more fun. College isn't like that fun, like compared to just traveling. So I just don't get the mindset. And it's just like I've known so many people from when I was younger, coworkers, for instance, that spent a year at college and they really had no interest in going to college at all, but their parents forced them and they were young enough that they didn't really
surprising amount, yeah.
Yeah, and they were just too young to feel like they could challenge their parents, I guess.
Sure.
But it's just like, now these people have student debt, like potentially like tens of $1,000s of student debt to go to a college they didn't want to go to, and now they work at, Panera Bread or Starbucks or at a restaurant, and it's going to take them forever to pay that off. Like, we need to stop. Education's a good thing and it should be encouraged, but like, between like how expensive college is and the fact that not necessarily everybody would benefit from a college education, which doesn't mean they're stupid. They just have like a different set of skills an interest. They wouldn't benefit from, sitting in a classroom all day for a degree they're not going to use or maybe not even finish. We need to change the culture on that. And I do kind of blame like Generation X, Generation Jones, the baby boomers for kind of instilling that on our millennial generation.
Well, and that's funny, of course, because that particular generation did not, by and large, have to go to college. And there were obviously many that did, because doctors, lawyers, that sort of thing. Many of the professional class did. However, there was a wealth of local and well-paying jobs that were available in at least the 50s and 60s that kind of started evaporating in the 70s as the economy started to stagnate. And then that push for college came from a need when all those apprenticeship level jobs started to evaporate a little bit in the late 20th century. That push for college started to accumulate for a 4-year degree. At some point, of course, as with many things, that does go too far. And then the push for college starts to turn into, well, now you're just doing it for the sake of the sake of posterity, where there's nothing at the end of the tunnel. And that I think that you mentioned, I want to see a change in that culture. I do think you're seeing a little bit of a change in that culture because people are quite aware of the fact that you can't go get a degree in gender studies or
Well, like, not even just, let's expand on this. Like, for example, like my father, he works in sales management. He's not rich, but like makes good money. But like, the thing is, he has a bachelor's degree in English,
yeah.
and he's like never taught an English class, never tutored an English student. And, like, he's fine or whatever. He's like, upper middle class, like, has a decent lifestyle. Things worked out for him. But like, did he really need the English degree to do this though? Like, and at
Hmm.
least back then, this is when college was like more affordable. My dad's in his like mid 50s, so different generation. But it's just, you don't necessarily need. He just kind of did what a lot of people did, majored in something he found interesting. And I think like what happened is like early on in his career, he had like a family friend connection that got his foot in the door somewhere, and he just worked his way up because he's an intelligent guy. But like his career in that case though had more to do with like a connection at like a younger age than him having an English degree.
Sure.
And that's another thing. Like, maybe we could do more. Like, instead of having like a bachelor's degree as a requirement, maybe have like the corporate culture change. For like maybe you get like a certificate in something. Like you could get a certificate in management or something. It would be like, okay, it's a certificate
Yeah.
in management. If he does well in this company in like 2 years, we'll make him a manager or something. That would make more sense than
Yeah.
getting an English degree and spending 4 years at a college majoring in
Well,
English.
for me, how it was treated is basically, well, this gets your foot in the door. That phrase was used a lot. It gets your foot in the door. And then, of course, once your foot is in the door, other avenues become open to you. And then looking back, it's like, well, why did I do that 4-year degree? Well, I do appreciate the time I had getting my college degree, and it did teach me a lot. 90% of it, yeah, I don't use actively, but at least it did teach me the the broad scope of engineering as a whole. And perhaps for engineering, it's a little bit different than, say, like your example with your father, how he got an English degree, and that did not really factor into his future endeavors. There is also a corporate push that is behind this as well, to a degree, in that colleges a lot of the times are used in order to instill a corporate or a professional structure. So what you're really generating is people with professional values, and that's why a lot of the liberal arts colleges instill these professional values, liberal ideals, in order to build a professional class who are then hired into the professional world. I watched this is a funny aside, but it is relevant. I watched a TikTok recently, and the TikTok was of this woman who was a sales, um, not even a sales manager, but like a sales analyst who would do like marketing analysis and give recommendations to the marketing team of what avenues to take. Basically, she was recommending things. She was um, counseling the marketing team, and she went through a day uh, of her in the office, basically as a TikTok, and all she did was she went to go get food. She then had a meeting where she had a bunch of post-its with like buzzwords on them. She walked around the office a little bit. She went to go get more food, and then she had a night out with getting wine. And the day in the office seemed like not. It seemed like she was just enjoying being in the city. That was her time in the office. But what she did have was a very professional work ethic and a very professional set of ideals that she kind of embodied. And she just lived in the city and basically walked around the city with her friends who were her coworkers. And they talked about stuff. And then they would give recommendations to the actual marketing team who would execute on these recommendations. And it seemed like such a bizarre thing until I kind of thought about this whole corporate professional class, building a professional class. And a lot of that happens in colleges. A lot of those ideals are instilled in colleges still. As far as though employment is concerned, that's getting less and less to be the case. Statistically, I see that. And also just within my friend groups, I see that. And I guess that's where I'll leave that.
So here's one thing I wanted to discuss. We have kind of talked about the midterms a little bit, though. But one thing I wanted to bring up is there's a Huffington Post article about the midterms and how critical race theory was used by the Republicans in the midterms. And polling shows that there was an attempt by the Republicans to make critical race theory a key issue. Part of this was because in Virginia, when Glenn Youngkin ran, he made this essential part, and some people attribute to him using critical race theory as a political issue to part of why he won. We could speculate whether or not that really was the factor of him winning that election. Virginia obviously is a bit of a purple state right now, though it has gone blue 2008, 2016, 2020. But that being said, just kind of like expanding off of that, it's kind of similar to this abortion issue we discussed earlier. Just Republicans kind of want to fight the culture more, apparently, and this is sort of like the new hot issue about parental choice. Is that some parents don't want what they claim is critical race theory, although we never really get a clear definition from these people in terms of what critical race theory actually is that this culture issue ended up not really being beneficial for Republicans in the 2022 midterms. And where I want to kind of expand with that is, if the Republicans are going to be successful in the future, are they really benefiting from writing these culture war issues? It doesn't specifically have to be critical race theory. That's just kind of an example I gave. Or would they be better off focusing more on economic issues? It's unclear to me, what the Republicans' economic platform actually is. We hear a lot about inflation. We hear a lot about job growth, which are just kind of the things they've always campaigned on. But I think what I would go forward is like as we move towards the 2024 election, as we get closer to that election, I don't feel like the Republican Party, while they are theoretically in a position where they could win in 2024, they don't have what I would call a cohesive platform that appeals to everyone and not just Tea Party type Republicans. They seem to be trying to ride this wave of, anti-political correctness,
Sure.
kind of going back to the whole like social justice warrior phenomenon, which I don't think is as significant as some people want to make it out to be. But it just, I guess, from my perspective, it doesn't seem that these culture war issues are working. I don't think most Americans, including a lot of like more moderate independent types, really care about issues like critical race theory. And, if this is what the Republicans are going to build off of coming in the next few elections, I just don't think, based on the polling I'm seeing and the research I'm done, that this is going to be something that they can really ride to a landslide election, in my opinion.
Yeah, I wouldn't think so either. Um, and when it comes to like keeping a party discussing what you call the culture war, I would say this is that one party, any party, whether it's Democrats, Republicans, whatever the party is always better off speaking materially and speaking from material changes. For example, with Republicans, it could be immigration. That's at least it's a material issue. How you feel about it might be how you feel about it. But immigration is a material issue. Healthcare, material issue. That's something that materially has some impact. Yeah, critical race theory, whatever that might be, doesn't really have much material impact. That's more of a culture thing. And one party is always better off speaking about a material issue. And they always want the other party to be speaking about a rhetorical cultural issue. That's almost always that's gonna be what solidifies victories or defeats from a campaigning standpoint. If you're campaigning about something material and the other party is campaigning about something entirely rhetorical, you're on the better footing, almost always. And an example of this, I guess, would be from the other perspective, going back to like 2015, 2016, I think that it was almost a little bit, the parties were a little backwards on this point, in that the progressive side of the Democrats had a lot of wind in their sails, and they were pushing a lot of rhetorical cultural issues, whereas the Republicans were pushing more material things and more materially impactful things. They also had a rhetorical nightmare going on with, I'll call it a nightmare, a rhetorical phenomenon going on with what was going on with Donald Trump at the time. But currently, moving forward to today, all of those kind of culture war issues, things even like DeSantis has done this too, with the trans, there was trans athletes that were competing. I think it was a swimming competition. Does this sound familiar at all?
I think it was too. Yeah, I think it was a swimming competition.
So he made a rhetorical statement and a rhetorical order that the trans athlete didn't actually win because it hurts women's abilities to compete. That's entirely rhetorical. That's just to keep him in the limelight. Of course, he's not trying to win an election with that issue. He's just trying to stay in the spotlight. So there are times when you want to just stay in the spotlight, and that will be when you want to do all this rhetorical culture war stuff. But when it actually comes down to building a platform, material stuff always wins out. So if the Republican Party are currently on a more culture war rhetorical standpoint, they'll eventually need to pivot away from that, and they'll have to start talking about more material stuff, like you say, economic stuff, whatever it might be at the time. However, it's hard to know exactly what material stuff will work well in 2024. Like you say, it's a while away. For the midterms, it didn't seem like, honestly, I didn't feel like any particular party had a really good material landing. Roe v. Wade was a big one. But even that, I think was underutilized. Personally, I think was underutilized by the Democrats. I don't think they played it out as well as they could have. I think they were kind of playing defense on that issue for whatever reason. But regarding what you're saying about a culture war, yeah, culture wars never play well in election times. It's just exhausting. But if you want to keep yourself in the limelight for a specific amount of time, yeah, go ahead, be rhetorical as you want. I mean, we talked about Kanye, 2 weeks ago? And his was entirely rhetorical culture war crap. He didn't have any material positions, but he's not trying to win elections. He's just trying to stay in the limelight.
Yeah, and it's all very short term. I mean, it kind of goes back to like when we first became friends, is kind of what I thought about.
Oh, yeah?
There was kind of this rave, and it wasn't necessarily like the Republican Party establishment, but it was like we see a lot of these things like the Rubin Report and like Louder with Crowder and all of this stuff. They were
Right.
kind of riding this like internet fame wave of the social justice warriors at like college campuses.
Yeah.
And it was like they got like a little attention for it, but it's just like I don't think I haven't heard anybody use the phrase social justice warrior in like such a long time. And it was just like this really short term with people like Milo Yiannopoulos kind of made like a little brief career out of this. I don't want to talk about him too much because it's just gives me a headache personally to think of that.
I was thinking him exactly when we were talking about this, when you mentioned the whole college campuses thing. That was the name that came to mind.
Yeah, he made this whole like, hey, I'm gonna go to campuses and like offend people, and it's just like that's great, I guess, but that's not.
Right.
You can't really make like a long term, and this is why the part of the reason why the alternative right fizzled out is like this isn't like really something you can make a long term, comprehensive campaign platform. I mean, politics is very complicated. We're talking about macroeconomic policy, we're talking about international relations and geopolitics, and all you really have is like, hey, look, I took this YouTube video of like these hipster college kids being politically correct. And yeah, like I was saying, it's just you can't really make a comprehensive policy, platform, just based on making fun of, college students at liberal arts campuses, uh, as a political platform. So I guess what I would say in conclusion is it's just, it just makes me think back to like that 2015, 2016 wave of, anti-social justice warrior phenomenon that we experienced. And, it's just a phase. And it was kind of one final point I'll make about this. I remember during that time, I would find these YouTube videos of these conservatives interviewing, liberal college students. And some of them actually did say some things that were kind of cringe. And I guess the videos, while I didn't like them, had like some comedic value. But then, like, years later, I'd see these kind of videos, and it would just be like a liberal college student saying something that was like politically liberal, I guess. And then they'd be like, oh, cringe, 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 cringe. I'm like, this isn't really like this whole thing kind of like ran out. It was funny for like a few months, and then everybody else moved on. But you have like these.
It's short lived, yeah. They're all about right now, right here, right now, and then it dies.
Well, democracy dies in darkness, as Washington Post would say. But anyway, I think that basically summarizes our show. I think we had a great show today and a lot of issues. Ted, do you have any final words?
Well, on this point, I guess I do have a little more to say. Because you're right, it's very short-lived and it's very cutting at the moment and then it's gone. It's in history. But as far as who's in the limelight and who gets to talk, keeping those instantaneous, what are we talking about right now points can be very important in order to determine who gets to talk, if that makes sense. So although as far as general consensus goes, almost always those limelight chasers never really get to the heart of particular issues, and they never really cut to, oh, we're going to remember Milo Yiannopoulos forever as this great thinker. That's not going to happen, right? But they do determine a lot about in-the-moment politics. And by in-the-moment politics, I sort of do mean who gets to talk on the stage and who gets to set the tone for the moment, even though that tone for the moment is gone in the next moment. That's what I wanted to point out. But you're right. I think that we have covered quite a bit today, and I think that we've had a great time doing it. I hope that everyone out there listening has had a great time listening to us. Sam, anything to add?
I'm just want to one last time say, happy holidays and happy new year, and, stay safe.
And we'll see you next year.